Winter, 1944. A collapsing Axis field hospital clings to life as distant artillery shakes the frozen ground. Nurses scramble in the dim light, trying to keep their wounded alive with the last of their supplies. Then, through the smoke, American soldiers appear. Not as attackers, but as rescuers. Calm, steady, unshaken. What happened next stunned every Axis nurse on that field. Stay with us as we uncover this extraordinary true wartime moment. The moment those American soldiers emerged from the winter haze in 1944 did not happen in isolation. It was the result of months of collapsing logistics, exhausted personnel, and a medical system inside the Axis ranks that was beginning to break under the weight of its own war. To understand why that single encounter stunned the nurses who lived through it, we must step back into the conditions that shaped their desperate situation. By late 1943 and into early 1944, the Axis medical network in Italy was reaching the end of its strength. The Italian campaign had already consumed thousands of lives, stretched supply routes to the breaking point, and forced medical teams, German, Italian, and civilian volunteers, to work with dwindling resources. Morphine stocks were nearly gone. Bandages were reused until they resembled thin sheets of gray paper. Blood plasma, once distributed in carefully measured glass bottles, became a rarity that nurses prayed for but seldom saw. Even basic antibiotics were scarce, and infection was often the silent enemy that claimed more lives than the bullets. The nurses at these field hospitals carried the weight of all of it. Some had medical training from peacetime civilian clinics, others had received only brief wartime instruction before being thrown into frontline chaos. Many were young women who had once worked in village hospitals or Red Cross posts. The psychological pressure was tremendous, wounded soldiers arriving in endless waves, retreating units falling back through the mountains, rumors that front lines were collapsing faster than orders could be sent. Their field stations were never meant to stand alone, but now they were isolated, exposed, and dangerously close to the shifting combat zones. Behind this breakdown stood a deeper structural issue. The Axis medical evacuation system was built on assumptions that no longer held. When the war began, planners believed they could move wounded rearward through transport columns and rail lines with relative stability. But Allied air superiority shattered that assumption. Roads were bombed, convoys destroyed, and rail stations left in ruins. Ambulances could barely move without being spotted from above. The once reliable chain of evacuation turned into a string of disconnected shelters, each forced to fend for itself. Meanwhile, on the opposing side, the U.S. military had developed one of the most advanced battlefield medical systems the world had ever seen. American evacuation units functioned like a living machine, frontline medics stopping bleeding within minutes, litter teams carrying soldiers to aid stations, surgical hospitals deployed close to the front, and motorized ambulances ready to move survivors to safer zones. Each step was organized, tested, and supported by vast amounts of supplies, bandages, plasma, medicines, blankets, and trained personnel. This difference in medical capability was not lost on the Axis nurses. Many had heard stories, whispered through retreating soldiers, that American forces treated wounded prisoners with surprising care. Some dismissed the accounts as exaggerations or propaganda. Others wondered whether the Americans truly operated under a different code of conduct. But none of them expected to see that behavior firsthand, especially not in the middle of winter, with their own hospital on the edge of collapse. What made their situation even more dire was the geography of Italy itself. Mountain passes froze shut. Valleys became kill zones for artillery. Field hospitals, often placed in farmhouses or church basements, were impossible to relocate quickly. When the order to withdraw came, they had to choose, save the wounded who could be moved, or stay with those who could not. For the nurses still in the facility the Americans would soon encounter, the choice was already made. They stayed. And they prepared to deliver medical care until the final moments, whether the enemy arrived or not. The tension in these late war months was overwhelming. Every distant engine sound might signal a convoy, or an Allied airstrike. Every radio message carried uncertainty. Supplies that once arrived weekly now came once a month, if at all. Even kerosene for lamps was rationed, surgeries were sometimes performed in dim, flickering light. This is the world those Axis nurses lived in, exhausted, isolated, committed to their duty, and surrounded by growing evidence that their side of the war was unraveling. Their field hospital, once part of a coordinated medical chain, had become an island, holding the injured, the dying, and the last remnants of hope. And it was into this collapsing world that the American soldiers walked, bringing with them a level of order, discipline, and humanitarian strength the Axis medical staff had never expected. That is where the story turns toward its most remarkable moment. To understand the weight of the moment that stunned the Axis nurses, we must step onto the ground where it happened. The winter landscape of the Italian front in early 1944 was a harsh and unforgiving place, cold enough to freeze equipment, wet enough to soak through every layer of clothing, and rugged enough to turn even the simplest task into a battle of its own. The incident took place near a cluster of stone farm buildings in the foothills south of the Liri Valley. Before the war, it had been a quiet agricultural property surrounded by terraced fields and olive groves. By early 1944, it had become a makeshift field hospital, a temporary sanctuary created out of necessity, not design. Inside, the rooms were cramped, lit by weak lamps, and filled with wounded men lying on straw mattresses and wooden cots. Outside, the world was gray, cold, and echoing with distant artillery. The geography mattered. Italy's rugged terrain dictated not only where troops could move but also where medical units could hide. Steep ridges and winding valleys limited motor transport, slowed evacuation, and forced medical teams to settle wherever they found shelter. That farmhouse hospital was never meant to be permanent, it simply became the last defensible place available as the Axis lines collapsed toward the north. The winter of 1944 was particularly brutal. Snow had fallen early and often. Nights were bitter enough that even healthy men struggled to endure prolonged exposure, and the wounded suffered even more severely. Nurses had to rotate blankets between patients simply to share warmth. Water froze in buckets. Surgical tools had to be warmed over small stoves before use. Every breath inside the farm buildings produced a faint cloud, and every footstep outside cracked through frozen mud. Days and nights blended together. The Axis nurses rarely slept more than a few hours at a time. They moved from one patient to the next, rewrapping bandages that desperately needed replacing, warming stiff limbs, and doing everything possible with what little they had. Their world had shrunk to the radius of that farmyard. Everything beyond it was threat, uncertainty, or silence. Around them, the sounds of war created an ever-present tension. The Allies were pushing north with relentless force. American artillery units, well-supplied and precisely coordinated, pounded enemy defenses day and night. When the guns fell quiet, it often meant the infantry was advancing. When they roared again, it signaled that resistance had stiffened. For the nurses, each change in the rhythm of fire brought new anxiety. They never knew when their quiet farm might become a battleground. By early 1944, the front line was fluid and often unpredictable. Patrols from both sides moved through the hills, sometimes passing within sight of each other without exchanging fire. German units retreated in patches, some withdrawing rapidly while others attempted to hold ground. Communications were unreliable. Orders were delayed or outdated. It wasn't always clear who controlled which ridge or valley. This confusion is what ultimately left the Axis Field Hospital exposed. The nurses had been warned that evacuation might become necessary. But evacuation required transport, and transport required fuel, manpower, and clear roads, none of which existed anymore. The few ambulances they had were either immobilized by mechanical failures or simply out of gasoline. Most of their wounded were too fragile to be moved across steep, icy paths. Even if they tried, the narrow roads leading away from the farmhouse were under frequent Allied observation. Moving a long line of stretchers could have been disastrous. And so the nurses did what medical personnel throughout history have often done when armies move faster than the wounded: they stayed. Not out of loyalty to the Axis cause, but out of loyalty to the men lying helpless in their care. They knew that leaving would mean surrendering those patients to the cold and to the chaos of combat. It was a choice made with trembling hands and heavy hearts. Meanwhile, the Americans were advancing with far greater stability. Their air superiority provided near-constant reconnaissance. Their medical units traveled with infantry, supported by jeeps, half-tracks, and trained medics who brought order into the battlefield's confusion. When American patrols moved forward, they carried not only weapons but also morphine, plasma, and field dressings, supplies their opponents could only dream of by this stage of the war. This contrast, Axis scarcity versus American abundance, set the stage for what was about to happen. By the morning of the incident, the nurses heard unfamiliar engine sounds coming from the valley below. Not German. Not Italian. Deeper. Stronger. More rhythmic. The sound of well-maintained American vehicles. They froze. Some feared the worst. Others simply braced themselves for whatever the next chapter of the war would bring. They didn't yet know that the men approaching were not coming to destroy their fragile refuge. They were coming to protect it, and the people inside. And that is where the story shifts from desperation to something far more unexpected. The nurses inside that stone farmhouse had lived through months of pressure few civilians could comprehend. Their hands were raw from washing what little equipment they had. Their backs ached from lifting and turning wounded men. Their eyes burned from smoke, sleeplessness, and cold. Yet through all of it, They never imagined they would witness a moment that challenged everything they believed about the enemy advancing toward them. That moment began quietly, with a human angle that revealed just how fragile the scene had become. One of the youngest nurses, barely in her 20s, had spent the morning checking pulses and adjusting blankets. Her hands shook not from fear but from exhaustion. She knew several patients were not stable enough to survive another night in freezing conditions. The sound of distant engines, American engines, grew louder. In her mind, she prepared for surrender, confrontation, or worse. She expected orders to abandon their wounded or hide. Instead, what approached was something far more disciplined and strangely humane. The terrain around the farmhouse forced both sides to move carefully. The Americans advancing through the hills did not rush blindly. Their training demanded caution, perimeter checks, and coordinated movement. Every footstep mattered. Even before they reached the farmhouse, they knew a medical unit was present. Reconnaissance reports mentioned stretcher activity around the building. Air observers noted smoke from small cooking fires, likely medical staff boiling water, not soldiers preparing an ambush. This information shaped their approach. Instead of combat formation, the Americans moved with deliberate calm. Rifles ready, yes, but not raised. Their mission was to secure the area, assess potential threats, and identify civilians or medical personnel at risk. Their calm posture contrasted sharply with the frantic pace the Axis nurses expected. That contrast would form one of the most striking angles of the entire event. Inside the farmhouse, fear mixed with resignation. The nurses knew they were exposed. They had no reinforced bunkers, no trenches, no defensive positions. Their patients, bandaged, pale, drifting between lucidity and fever, were unable to move. Many clutched rosaries, letters, or photographs of families far from the battlefield. A few whispered that the Americans would show no mercy. Others remained silent, lost in the quiet terror that accompanies helplessness. But outside, the Americans saw something different. They saw a vulnerable medical outpost, thinly staffed, barely supplied, and surrounded by injured men who posed no danger. Their training emphasized not only discipline under fire but also strict adherence to the rules governing medical units. A wounded soldier, friend or enemy, was a casualty to be protected, not harmed. This doctrine didn't change because of who wore which uniform. It was part of the U.S. Army's identity, a defining principle that made their battlefield conduct stand out across the war. The nurses expected hostility. The Americans gave structure. The first American to enter the courtyard was a medic with a Red Cross armband, stepping forward cautiously but without aggression. Behind him, infantrymen moved into defensive positions around the perimeter. They checked for booby traps, retreating Axis units, or hidden threats. But once the area was secure, their posture softened. Their voices lowered. Their movements slowed. They switched from combat mode into stabilization mode, as though they were stepping into a field hospital of their own. To the nurses watching through the windows, it was surreal. The enemy acted with a level of calm professionalism they associated only with their own officers during the early years of the war. Now, near the end, when everything around them was falling apart, it was the Americans who displayed the discipline the Axis force could no longer sustain. The medical aspect of this moment offered another powerful angle. American medics carried supplies that seemed almost unreal to the nurses who had been scraping by for months. Clean bandages sealed in wax paper. Vials of morphine. Rolls of gauze. Plasma kits. Even simple items, fresh canteens, blankets, sterile dressings, looked like treasures. When the Americans realized the nurses were trying to treat their wounded with next to nothing, their reaction was immediate. They offered assistance. Not forcefully. Not with condescension. Simply as professionals recognizing fellow caregivers in crisis. This quiet respect was something the nurses did not expect. Many had been told that Americans were reckless, undisciplined, and careless about human life. But here, in the freezing courtyard, the Americans demonstrated the opposite, an unwavering commitment to preserving life wherever possible. They worked alongside the nurses, examining patients, assessing injuries, and stabilizing the most fragile cases. Yet beneath this cooperation lay a deeper, more psychological angle. The nurses understood the war was turning against them. They had seen the look in retreating soldiers' eyes. They heard rumors of overwhelming American air power, supply lines that never seemed to run dry, and troops who fought with precision rather than desperation. But seeing it firsthand was something entirely different. The Americans' calmness under pressure, their ability to blend combat readiness with medical compassion, revealed a level of power that went beyond weapons or numbers. It was the power of order in a world collapsing into chaos. For the Axis nurses, this moment forced a reckoning. Their own forces were strained, disorganized, and retreating. Their medical system could no longer cope with the scale of suffering. They were being overtaken not only militarily but ethically, procedurally, and logistically. And the Americans standing in their courtyard embodied that superiority quietly, without boastfulness. Dominance did not need to be shouted when it could be demonstrated through competence. The Americans were not simply stronger. They were steadier. And in war, steadiness is the ultimate advantage. As the sun began its slow descent behind the hills and the cold sharpened again, a quiet understanding formed between the nurses and the Americans. Whatever came next, danger, artillery, or evacuation, they would face it together. For the first time in months, the nurses did not feel alone. And what happened next would test that fragile alliance under the pressure of fire. For a brief instant, as the Americans secured the perimeter around the farmhouse, everything stood suspended between fear and possibility. The Axis nurses were frozen in place, exhausted women holding on to the last threads of their duty, while the Americans, steady and composed, assessed the scene with the kind of practiced discipline that only came from months of organized, confident advance. The moment true contact occurred was surprisingly quiet. No shouting. No threats. No raised rifles. Instead, it began with a simple gesture, an American medic stepping forward with his hands visible, carrying a medical kit, signaling he meant no harm. His posture alone was enough to shift the atmosphere inside the farmhouse. The nurses were stunned. They had been preparing for confrontation. What they saw instead was reassurance. One of the senior nurses stepped outside first, wrapped in a worn wool coat, her breath fogging the cold air. She moved cautiously, unsure whether she would be detained or ignored. But the Americans treated her with the respect given to any medical professional on a battlefield. A lieutenant approached her, not with hostility, but with calm authority, and asked brief, essential questions using simple gestures and carefully chosen words. Even without sharing a language, they understood each other through the universal grammar of urgency and care. The Americans quickly recognized the seriousness of the situation. Many of the wounded inside the farmhouse were in critical condition. Some had shrapnel embedded deep in their limbs. Others suffered from advanced infections that needed immediate attention. Several were barely holding on after nights without sufficient warmth or medication. The American medics exchanged glances. This was a humanitarian crisis, not a military post. Within minutes, American soldiers began distributing blankets, canteens, and spare dressings. They moved efficiently, without hesitation. To the nurses watching, it felt as though the room itself warmed simply by their arrival. The Americans' hands were steady, practiced, confident, traits that come from training supported by abundant resources. It was a standard the Axis medical teams had once held, but could no longer maintain under the crushing weight of retreat. For the wounded lying on cots and makeshift beds, the sight of American uniforms brought mixed reactions. Some tensed, expecting punishment. Others stared in disbelief. A few foreign prisoners, men from Eastern Europe and North Africa pressed into Axis service, began to cry quietly, realizing that help was finally within reach. The Americans treated them all the same, with the impartiality that defined their medical doctrine. Outside the farmhouse, additional American units set up a temporary security ring. Rifles pointed outward, scanning the ridgeline for signs of retreating Axis units. The Americans knew that a trapped medical station could become a target either intentionally or by accident, during the chaos of shifting front lines. Their job was clear: protect the wounded, protect the nurses, and prepare for a safe evacuation if conditions allowed. As the Americans worked, the nurses found themselves drawn into the rhythm of the moment. A young American medic, barely older than some of the wounded, demonstrated how to stabilize a fractured leg with improvised splints. Another showed how to use plasma kits efficiently, rationing supplies to ensure the sickest patients received care first. The nurses, fatigued but attentive, followed their lead. It was the first time in months they had worked with a sense of true support. This cooperative atmosphere, German nurses, Italian volunteers, and American soldiers working side by side, would have seemed unimaginable just weeks earlier. But war reshapes expectations. It reveals character. And the Americans' character in this moment was unmistakable: disciplined, compassionate, and overwhelmingly prepared. Yet beneath this calm collaboration, every person in the farmhouse felt the weight of something approaching. The distant artillery, once a background presence, began to grow louder and more regular. The Americans' expressions sharpened. Their movements became more focused. A runner approached the lieutenant and spoke in urgent tones. Something was coming, and whatever it was closing fast. The nurses sensed it too. The air seemed to tighten. The ground felt different beneath their feet, as though warning them of what was rolling over the hills. This moment of contact, this fragile, extraordinary cooperation, was about to be tested by the full reality of war once again. The Americans stayed calm, gathering everyone inside and preparing to shield the wounded. Because the next moments would define the event that would never leave the nurses' memories. The warning arrived not with words, but with the unmistakable rhythm of incoming artillery. A distant thump. A low, rolling echo through the valley. Then another. And another. Each shell sounded closer than the last. The American lieutenant's jaw tightened as he listened. He didn't panic. He didn't shout. He simply recognized what the Axis nurses had feared for days. The battlefield was shifting toward their fragile sanctuary, and it was shifting fast. Inside the farmhouse hospital, the atmosphere changed instantly. The nurses paused mid-task, their breath catching. For months, they had lived under the threat of bombardment, but this time felt different. The Americans had brought structure and calm, but now even they could not stop the sky from turning hostile. The lieutenant gave a quiet, decisive order. Within seconds, American soldiers moved with trained efficiency. Some reinforced the outer perimeter. Others began preparing to evacuate patients, triaging them with astonishing speed. The medics moved from one wounded soldier to another, determining who could be carried safely, who needed stabilization, and who required immediate shelter inside the thickest walled room of the farmhouse. A shell landed just far enough away to shake dust from the ceiling but close enough to remind everyone how little time they had. One of the nurses flinched, instinctively shielding a patient. An American medic placed a steadying hand on her shoulder and guided her toward a stretcher team. There was no room for fear now, only action. The farmhouse courtyard became a scene of controlled urgency. Americans formed stretcher teams, 2 soldiers at the front, 2 at the back, while nurses guided them to the most critical patients. The coordination was almost seamless. Where the nurses hesitated from exhaustion, the Americans stepped in, lifting and securing wounded men with practiced strength. Outside, the sound of artillery grew sharper. Shells walked their way up the valley, one by one, methodically searching for movement. The Americans knew the danger intimately. They had been under fire countless times. But what made this moment remarkable was not just their steadiness under pressure, it was their determination to protect people who, only hours earlier, had been considered the enemy. Inside the farmhouse, an Axis nurse struggled to lift a patient too large for her to handle alone. Without a word, a broad-shouldered American infantryman stepped in, lifting the wounded man as if he weighed nothing. The nurse's eyes widened, not just from surprise, but from the realization that this man, who in another circumstance might have been her adversary, was now fighting to save her patient's life. More shells crashed closer. "Move," an American medic called, not with panic, but with urgency. Stretcher after stretcher moved toward the cellar entrance, the safest part of the farmhouse. The cellar, reinforced with stone walls nearly a foot thick, became the designated shelter point. American soldiers cleared debris, widened the entrance, and created a path for the wounded. Outside, 2 American soldiers braced themselves as they carried a stretcher across the slick, frozen courtyard. A sharp whistle cut through the cold air. A shell was incoming, close. They didn't drop the stretcher. They didn't run. They quickened their pace, shielded the patient with their bodies, and pushed through the cellar doorway just seconds before the shell exploded near the tree line. The ground shook. Windows cracked. The farmhouse trembled like a living thing. But the Americans kept moving. The nurses, though frightened, followed their lead. They worked beside the soldiers, guiding them toward the patients whose conditions were most fragile. One nurse, her face pale with fatigue, clutched a plasma bottle while an American medic inserted a line into a wounded soldier's arm. Another nurse used her body to protect a patient from flying dust and falling plaster as another shell hit dangerously close. Then came the most perilous moment. A direct hit landed near the western wall of the farmhouse, blowing apart a small storage shed and sending fragments of wood and stone across the courtyard. For a moment, everything vanished in smoke and debris. Screams echoed, but the Americans moved toward the danger, not away from it. Through the haze, 2 stretcher teams rushed forward. A German patient who had been waiting outside for transfer was thrown to the ground by the blast. An American medic knelt beside him, checked his pulse, and signaled for immediate evacuation. A nearby nurse tried to help, her hands trembling, but the medic steadied her and guided her back into the shelter. "We've got him," he said, not in her language, but in a universal tone that conveyed absolute certainty. Amid the chaos, the Americans' command presence held everything together. Soldiers used their bodies as shields, placing themselves between the incoming fire and the wounded. Others formed a protective corridor to the cellar. Their discipline didn't falter, even as explosions rattled the hillside. One by one, the wounded were moved into safety. Inside the cellar, lanterns flickered. The room was cold but secure. Americans and Axis nurses worked shoulder to shoulder, bandaging wounds, stabilizing fractures, and calming those in shock. The floor was crowded with stretchers, but for the first time in days, there was a sense of genuine safety. The barrage outside slowly faded. The valley quieted. The farmhouse stopped shaking. And in that stillness, the nurses finally understood, their patients were alive because the Americans had made them a priority. Because American soldiers had risked their lives, without hesitation, to protect people they did not know, did not command, and did not share a language or uniform with. When the last shell landed and silence settled over the hills, the nurses looked around the cellar and saw something they would never forget. Americans, calm, disciplined, dirt-covered, and breathing hard, standing guard over their patients. The moment had passed, but the meaning of it had only begun. When the artillery finally stopped and the last echoes faded into the cold Italian hills, a heavy stillness settled over the farmhouse. For the first time in hours, no one moved with urgency. No shells whistled overhead. No walls trembled. Only the soft, uneven breathing of the wounded filled the cellar. It was in that moment of fragile quiet that the nurses realized just how close they had come to losing everything, and how much the Americans had saved. The soldiers kept their positions for several minutes after the barrage ended, scanning the ridgeline for signs of advancing units or a second wave of fire. They had been trained to trust nothing in wartime. Silence could be a trap. But gradually, the tension in their shoulders eased. They lowered their rifles. A few wiped dust and debris from their helmets. One of the medics sat down heavily on a step, exhausted but still alert, as though waiting for any sign that someone else needed him. Inside the cellar, the atmosphere shifted from fear to an overwhelming awareness of survival. The nurses moved between patients, checking pulses, adjusting blankets, and whispering reassurances. Several of the wounded, Axis soldiers, prisoners from occupied territories, and even civilians caught in the fighting, looked up at the Americans with expressions that ranged from confusion to gratitude. The idea that their lives had been preserved because of the enemy was almost too large to absorb. One of the nurses, older than most, paused near the entrance and looked at the American lieutenant standing guard. His uniform was covered in dust, his face streaked with soot, yet his posture remained firm and controlled. In that single moment of eye contact, she understood what had unfolded. These soldiers had not been driven by orders alone, nor by some political motive. They had acted out of a sense of duty and humanity that transcended the battlefield. When the Americans began organizing the next phase, evacuation, the consequences of their actions became even clearer. Their goal was not simply to survive the bombardment. It was to bring every wounded person to safety. Working with remarkable coordination, they assessed the condition of each patient. Those who could be transported were prepared for movement. Those too fragile were carefully stabilized with new bandages, fresh plasma, and warm blankets. The cellar, though crowded, was alive with purposeful motion. The Americans brought a level of organization the nurses hadn't felt in months. Several German wounded remained in a state of shock, not from injury, but from the way the Americans treated them. One soldier, barely 20, clutched the hand of an American medic as if seeking assurance that the danger was truly gone. Another whispered a prayer, convinced that he had witnessed a miracle. The nurses observed these reactions with the quiet awareness that something far deeper than survival had taken place. As the hours passed, the Americans established a clear evacuation route down the valley, selecting paths shielded from enemy observation. Their superior logistics became evident again. They summoned jeeps, litter teams, and additional medics. They positioned their men at key points along the route to ensure a safe descent. It was the kind of military precision that had shaped the American advance through Italy, steady, deliberate, and built on preparation rather than desperation. By late afternoon, the first stretchers were carried out of the cellar. The nurses walked beside them, some holding 4 bottles, others supporting the heads of the wounded. The Americans guided them through the debris-strewn courtyard and toward the waiting vehicles. There was no sense of triumph, only quiet relief. For the nurses, the greatest shock came during this evacuation. They expected to be separated from their patients, or at best allowed to follow from a distance. Instead, the Americans insisted they accompany their wounded. They were treated not as prisoners or adversaries but as essential medical personnel whose presence mattered. It was a gesture that neither propaganda nor rumor had ever prepared them for. Word of the event spread quickly through Axis ranks in the region. Captured soldiers, wounded evacuees, and returning nurses all reported the same astonishing account. American troops had shielded an Axis field hospital from artillery and then helped deliver its patients safely. This was not a small act of kindness. It was a significant departure from what many had been told to expect. In a war defined by destruction, stories of mercy traveled far. German officers who later interviewed the surviving nurses were struck by their descriptions. They spoke of American discipline, calm under fire, and a level of medical professionalism they had not witnessed since the early months of the war. Some officers dismissed the reports as an isolated event, others quietly acknowledged that the Americans fought with an efficiency and moral clarity that the Axis could no longer match. In the broader context of the campaign, this moment, one small humanitarian act in a vast and brutal war, contributed to a shift in perception among enemy forces. For some Axis soldiers, it planted a seed of doubt about the inevitability of their cause. For others, it reinforced the idea that surrendering to American units offered a far better chance of survival than continuing to fight under collapsing leadership. But for the nurses themselves, the consequences were far more personal. They had lived through a moment where humanity overpowered hostility, where compassion prevailed over ideology. And when they looked back on the winter of 1944, it was not the thunder of artillery they remembered most, it was the sight of American soldiers lifting their patients, shielding them, and walking with unwavering purpose toward safety. This was the aftermath of that extraordinary moment. And it would shape the memories, and the hearts, of all who witnessed it. In the long history of war, most stories are told through the lens of battles won, territories gained, and strategies executed. But moments like the one that unfolded in that frozen Italian farmhouse remind us that the true measure of a nation is often revealed not in the fury of combat, but in the quiet decisions made when no one expects mercy and no reward is guaranteed. The nurses who survived that day carried with them a memory that stood apart from the destruction surrounding them, a memory of American soldiers who chose humanity over hostility, discipline over chaos, and compassion over indifference. For those nurses, the war eventually ended. The guns fell silent. The uniforms changed. And the farmhouse they once feared would become their final post returned to being a simple agricultural home. But the image of American soldiers lifting their patients, shielding them from artillery, and guiding them toward safety remained vivid for the rest of their lives. It was a story they repeated not because it glorified heroism, but because it revealed something rare in a war so often defined by suffering. For the Americans who took part in the rescue, the moment became another thread in the larger fabric of their campaign, one more act of professionalism carried out amid countless others. They didn't see themselves as heroes, they saw a duty to preserve life where life could still be saved. It was an instinct shaped by training, discipline, and a national belief that strength is measured not only by victory, but by character. And for history, this event stands as a reminder of what American power represented during the Second World War. It was not merely the might of industry, the precision of logistics, or the courage of soldiers on the front line. It was also the capacity to act with humanity even in the darkest moments. That moral strength, paired with military dominance, formed a combination the Axis powers could not match. In the end, the nurses' astonishment was not simply about survival. It was about the realization that even in a world torn apart by conflict, compassion could still emerge, carried forward by the steady hands of American soldiers who refused to let the wounded be abandoned to the storm.